I don't like to kill, but sometimes it can't be avoided.
Those words came from David Lewis Rice, a man who would go down in history as one of the most delusional and brutal mass murderers in the United States. In December of 1985, Rice murdered an entire family. Not over money, not over revenge, but over a lie more than 30 years old. A lie that had already been proven false in a court of law. Even today, Rice insists he did the right thing. By the end of this story, you can decide for yourself, did justice prevail, or was his punishment too lenient? Before we uncover how paranoia, extremist propaganda, and untreated delusion led to the slaughter of an innocent family, consider subscribing. These stories matter, and the victims deserve to be remembered for who they truly were, not for what their killer imagined them to be. Charles Goldmark was the kind of lawyer other lawyers quietly measured themselves against. A graduate of Yale Law School and a former U.S. Army intelligence officer, Charles combined sharp legal instincts with an uncommon sense of integrity. By the age of 41, he had co-founded his own successful law firm and established himself as a rising force in Washington state Democratic politics. He served as legal counsel to the state party and played a significant role in Senator Gary Hart's 1984 presidential campaign, working long hours behind the scenes where strategy mattered more than recognition. Despite his professional success, Charles was not aloof. Colleagues remembered him as approachable and unfailingly courteous, a man who made a point of remembering names, court clerks, junior attorneys, even opposing counsel. In a profession often marked by ego, Charles stood out for his calm demeanor and genuine respect for others. At home, he was simply Dad. His wife, Annie Goldmark, 37, was the emotional center of the household. A dedicated teacher, Annie balanced her career with raising their two sons, managing a schedule that seemed impossibly full, yet never chaotic. Friends described her as warm, efficient, and quietly funny, the kind of person who made hosting look effortless. She organized school events, maintained friendships, and somehow ensured that Charles, often lost in work, remembered to eat between meetings. Their sons were the light of their lives. Derek, 12, was energetic and competitive, happiest when he was moving. He loved basketball, soccer, and baseball, and his bedroom shelves held a growing collection of trophies and medals. Recently, he'd taken on the role of big brother with pride, teaching Colin how to shoot free throws in their driveway, patiently correcting his form. Colin, 10, was different, quieter, more introspective. While Derek played outside, Colin sat at the kitchen table with pencils and paper, filling sketchbooks with careful drawings. His fourth-grade teacher had been so impressed by one piece, a detailed portrait of the family dog, that she displayed it in her classroom, a small tribute to his talent. The Goldmarks lived at 3614 East Republican Street in Seattle's Madrona neighborhood, a peaceful area known for its tree-lined streets and proximity to Lake Washington. Their home was a 1920s craftsman, not the largest on the block, but full of warmth and character. Annie had personally redesigned the kitchen, and original hardwood floors creaked softly beneath decades of family life. A handmade Christmas wreath hung on the front door, crafted by Annie and the boys earlier that December. On Christmas Eve, 1985, they were expecting dinner guests at 7:30 p.m. The house was filled with quiet anticipation, the kind that comes with tradition and togetherness. Everything was exactly as it should have been. But the Goldmark family carried a burden they never asked for, one that did not begin with them, and one they could never fully escape. To understand how that burden came to exist, we have to go back to 1962, more than 2 decades before the murders. At the time, Charles's father, John Goldmark, was a well-respected Washington state representative running for re-election in Okanogan County. John was known as a thoughtful, principled lawmaker who focused on practical issues rather than ideology. He championed public education, particularly in rural communities that had long been overlooked. Voters trusted him, and his previous terms had been marked by steady, uncontroversial service. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the attacks began. A local newspaper editor named Ashley Holden launched a relentless smear campaign against John Goldmark. Week after week, Holden published articles accusing Goldmark of being part of a secret communist conspiracy aimed at undermining the United States from within. The claims were inflammatory, written in the language of fear that dominated the Cold War era. Holden's so-called evidence was thin, but emotionally potent. He pointed to the fact that John's wife, Sally Goldmark, had briefly joined the Communist Party in 1935, during the depths of the Great Depression. At the time, Sally was 23 years old, unemployed, and searching for answers in a collapsing economy. She attended only a handful of meetings, quickly realized the movement was not for her, and left the party. This occurred decades before she ever met John Goldmark. None of that mattered. Holden ignored context, timelines, and truth. He framed Sally's short-lived involvement as proof that the entire Goldmark family was part of a hidden, ongoing communist network. The accusations spread quickly. Local American Legion groups repeated the claims. Anonymous flyers appeared on car windshields. Far-right organizations amplified the story, adding their own distortions. Fear won. John Goldmark lost the primary election, and with it, his political career. Years of public service were erased by paranoia and misinformation. The Goldmarks refused to let the lies stand. They hired attorney William Dwyer and filed a libel lawsuit against Holden. The trial drew national attention, with prominent figures who had themselves been targeted during the McCarthy era testifying in support of the family. After weeks of testimony, the jury ruled decisively in the Goldmarks' favor, declaring the accusations false and awarding substantial damages. Legally, the Goldmarks were vindicated. But lies, once unleashed, rarely disappear. They lingered in extremist publications, recycled and reshaped over time, stripped of context and inflated with each retelling. By 1985, both John and Sally Goldmark were dead. Yet in the paranoid imagination of one man, the lie was still alive, and the Goldmark family remained marked as enemies. David Lewis Rice was 27 years old in December of 1985, though most people who encountered him assumed he was younger. He had a slight frame, unkempt brown hair, and a habit of avoiding eye contact, as if he were perpetually uncomfortable in his own skin. At the time, Rice had no permanent address. He drifted between homeless shelters in Seattle and slept in his battered Chevrolet when beds weren't available, carrying everything he owned with him. Violence had shaped David Rice long before he ever inflicted it. He was born in 1958 in Durango, Colorado, into a household dominated by fear. His father was a heavy drinker who frequently beat his mother, exposing David to abuse at an early age. By his teenage years, the family had fractured. His parents separated when he was 15, leaving him largely unsupervised and emotionally adrift. School became impossible to focus on amid the chaos at home, and he dropped out in the 10th grade. At 17, Rice joined the U.S. Navy, hoping military structure would offer him an escape. Instead, the experience ended in humiliation. He lasted only 4 weeks in boot camp before being discharged for an inability to adapt to military life. Fellow recruits later described him as withdrawn and prone to expressing paranoid ideas about communist infiltration within the government, beliefs he had absorbed from his father's angry, alcohol-fueled rants. The discharge deepened his sense of rejection and failure. In his early 20s, Rice married and had a son, but the relationship quickly deteriorated. Court records from the divorce paint a troubling picture. His wife cited irrational jealousy, controlling behavior, and escalating paranoia. He accused her of being a communist sympathizer based on the television programs she watched and the people she spoke to. After 18 months, she left him. The divorce was finalized in 1981, with Rice granted supervised visitation rights he never exercised. By 1982, he had effectively vanished from his son's life. Rice struggled to hold down steady work. Trained as a welder, he found jobs sporadically, but most employers let him go within weeks. He argued with supervisors, accused coworkers of spying on him, and sometimes disappeared for days without explanation. Each failure reinforced his belief that unseen forces were conspiring against him. By the early 1980s, Rice had drifted to Seattle, isolated, unemployed, and increasingly consumed by conspiracy theories. It was there that he met Ann Davis, a naturopath who allowed him to move into her apartment and introduced him to her social circle. Among them was a small extremist group known as the Duck Club, a gathering that would give Rice not only validation for his delusions, but a sense of purpose he had never before possessed. And it was there that his descent truly began. The Duck Club was not large, influential, or well-known, but it didn't need to be. Like many extremist groups, its power lay not in numbers, but in reinforcement. The group was founded by Homer Brand, a former Boeing employee who had been fired after distributing anti-Semitic flyers at work. Bitter and unemployed, Brand redirected his resentment into ideology, forming a small circle of like-minded individuals who met weekly in a nondescript building near Boeing Field in Seattle. The meetings drew between 20 and 30 people at their peak, mostly men, many unemployed, all deeply suspicious of the world around them. At the core of the Duck Club's belief system was a single, all-encompassing idea: that the United States was being secretly overtaken by a Jewish communist conspiracy operating from within the government, universities, media, and financial institutions. Every social change, economic setback, or personal failure could be explained through this lens. Their meetings followed a rigid pattern. Brand would begin by reading aloud from far-right newsletters and self-published pamphlets filled with conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic rhetoric, and warnings of imminent invasion. Members were then encouraged to share their own discoveries. Neighbors who seemed suspicious, co-workers who asked the wrong questions, strangers who didn't belong. Ordinary people became targets through rumor and imagination. Guest speakers were occasionally invited, further legitimizing the group's beliefs. One of the most influential was Colonel Gordon Jack Moore, a traveling conspiracy theorist who claimed to possess inside knowledge of communist infiltration within the US government. His speeches described elaborate, fictional military movements and secret enemy operations, delivered with the confidence of authority. For members of the Duck Club, his words felt like confirmation rather than speculation. David Rice attended his first Duck Club meeting in January 1985. He sat quietly, listening intently, rarely speaking. Others noticed how seriously he took the material. When pamphlets were passed around, Rice collected extra copies. He began keeping a notebook, carefully copying long passages by hand, underlining phrases about identifying and neutralizing enemies. The group gave him something he had never had before: certainty. In October 1985, Homer Brand introduced a familiar name. While digging through decades-old John Birch Society materials, he resurrected accusations against the Goldmark family. Brand confused dates, misidentified family members, and insisted without evidence that the Goldmarks remained active communists. None of it was true, but Rice treated it as fact. He wrote down every word Brand said. He later went to the Seattle Public Library, where he found court records from the Goldmark libel trial that explicitly proved the accusations false. To anyone else, this would have ended the matter. To Rice, it confirmed it. In his distorted reasoning, the existence of a trial meant there had to be something worth hiding. A legal victory became proof of a deeper conspiracy. The Duck Club had given Rice a framework where evidence no longer mattered. And once inside that framework, the Goldmark family became more than people. They became enemies. Once David Rice fixated on the Goldmark family, his behavior shifted from obsession to preparation. He began stalking them quietly and methodically. Rice parked near Charles Goldmark's law office during business hours, watching as Charles entered and left the building, noting the times and the cars he drove. On several occasions, he followed Charles home, maintaining distance, careful not to be seen. He observed the Madrona neighborhood, its traffic patterns, the rhythm of daily life on East Republican Street. Everything went into his notebook. Rice studied the family's routines with the precision of someone carrying out an assignment. He recorded when the lights went on in the morning, when the house went quiet at night, when the boys returned from school. He noted weekends, holidays, and deviations from normal patterns. To Rice, these were not ordinary observations. They were operational details. At the same time, he rehearsed. In his apartment, Rice practiced restraint techniques using toy handcuffs, timing how long it took him to secure someone's wrists. He tested chloroform on himself, holding a soaked cloth to his face and measuring how long it took to lose consciousness, then documenting how long the effects lasted. These experiments were dangerous, but Rice treated them as necessary preparation rather than warning signs of imminent violence. His notebook became a disturbing blend of sources. On one page were detailed notes copied from extremist pamphlets about identifying communist cells and eliminating threats. On the next were hand-drawn maps of the Goldmark home, descriptions of rooms, and reminders about doorways, staircases, and exits. The ideological and the practical merged into a single plan. As December approached, Rice became increasingly focused on timing. He wanted a moment when the family would be together and vulnerable, when outside interference would be unlikely. He believed holidays offered the perfect cover. Streets would be quieter, neighbors distracted, police occupied with other calls. By December 20th, 1985, Rice had made his decision. Christmas Eve. In his mind, the date carried symbolic weight. Families would be home celebrating. The city would be wrapped in routine and expectation. Most importantly, the Goldmarks would all be in one place: Charles, Annie, Derek, and Colin. That was exactly what Rice wanted. He stopped questioning the plan and began finalizing it. The choice of date transformed weeks of surveillance into inevitability. What had once been written notes and imagined scenarios hardened into intent. To Rice, the plan was no longer theoretical. It was a mission. And Christmas Eve was the deadline. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1985, David Rice put his plan into motion. At approximately 6:45 p.m., he parked his car several blocks away from the Goldmark home in Seattle's Madrona neighborhood. The street was quiet, the air cold, the houses lit with Christmas decorations. Rice walked the remaining distance carrying a white cardboard box wrapped neatly in holiday paper, its appearance carefully chosen to disarm suspicion. Inside were items he believed he would need: a toy gun, handcuffs, and a bottle of chloroform. At exactly 7 p.m., Rice rang the doorbell at 3614 East Republican Street. 10-year-old Colin Goldmark answered the door. Rice told him he had a Christmas delivery. When the door opened, Rice forced his way inside, brandishing the toy gun as if it were real. The family had no way of knowing it was fake. Within minutes, Charles and Annie Goldmark realized something was terribly wrong. Rice ordered them upstairs, threatening violence if they resisted. The family complied, hoping obedience would keep them safe. Upstairs, Rice bound Charles, Annie, Derek, and Colin. What followed was swift and brutal. Using a steam iron and then a knife, Rice attacked each member of the family. The violence was not chaotic. It was deliberate, driven by the distorted belief that he was carrying out a necessary act. None of the Goldmarks survived. The attack lasted less than half an hour. At 7:28 p.m., the doorbell rang again. Friends and colleagues of the Goldmarks had arrived for the planned Christmas Eve dinner. Their arrival startled Rice, interrupting whatever he had intended to do next. Panicked, he fled the house through a back door, leaving behind the devastation he had caused. The guests, confused by the lack of response, entered the home moments later. What they discovered was unimaginable. Police and emergency responders were called immediately, but there was nothing they could do. By the time officers arrived, the Goldmark family, Charles, Annie, Derek, and Colin, were dead. The crime shocked Seattle and quickly made national headlines. A respected lawyer, his wife, and their 2 young sons had been murdered in their own home on Christmas Eve. There was no apparent robbery, no obvious motive, and no immediate suspect. But the answer lay not in the house itself. It lay in a lie born decades earlier, and in the mind of a man who believed that lie demanded blood. The first to arrive after the Goldmarks' planned Christmas Eve dinner were friends Miro and Gertrude Vidovich. They had known the family for years and had been invited to celebrate with them at 7:30 p.m. Expecting a warm holiday gathering, they approached the house carrying wine and wrapped gifts. But when they rang the doorbell, no one answered. The lights inside glimmered through the windows, the Christmas tree standing bright and undisturbed, but the house was eerily silent. At first, they assumed the Goldmarks had stepped out for a last-minute errand. They waited, knocked again, and finally, growing uneasy, left to check with neighbors. Nothing seemed out of place from the outside, yet a deep unease began to settle over them. By 8:15 p.m., still unable to reach anyone by phone, they approached a neighbor, Bob Campbell, who agreed that something felt wrong. He called the Goldmarks' house directly, and although the phone rang inside, no one answered. The Vidoviches returned to the house, increasingly alarmed. By 10:30 p.m., Campbell called 911. As he spoke to the dispatcher, he pressed his ear to the front door and heard it, a low, gurgling moan emanating from somewhere inside. Officers James Pullery and Scott Tompkins were dispatched immediately. They found the front door locked, but a partially open window provided entry. Inside, the house was frozen in time. The living room looked as though no one had moved since setting out the Christmas decorations. Presents still beneath the tree, the kitchen untouched but for partially prepared dinner ingredients. As the officers climbed the stairs, their flashlights illuminated a scene that spoke volumes about what had occurred. In the master bedroom, Charles Goldmark lay barely alive, his injuries severe. Annie and 10-year-old Colin were dead. 12-year-old Derek survived, but only barely. He would remain in critical condition for weeks, ultimately succumbing to his injuries in early January. From the scene itself, investigators immediately understood the nature of the crime. Nothing had been stolen of value. Expensive electronics remained untouched. Jewelry was left behind. The chaos was not random. Every act pointed to meticulous planning, targeted aggression, and a deliberate focus on the family. It was clear. This was not a burglary gone wrong. Every detail told the same story. Surveillance, timing, methodical restraint, and the specific targeting of the Goldmarks indicated obsession, fueled by ideological delusions. This was an act of fixation, a calculated, premeditated assault on a family entirely innocent of the imagined threat that motivated their killer. The Goldmark murders were a chilling reminder that obsession can turn lethal, and that even the most ordinary family can be caught in the crossfire of someone else's paranoid beliefs. Just 2 days after the murders, on December 26, 1985, David Lewis Rice walked into the Admiral Benbow Inn in Seattle's University District. He had been drinking heavily since the attacks, trying in vain to drown the images of the Goldmark family. Patrons noticed his agitation. He spoke repeatedly about completing a mission and eliminating the top communist. Rice seemed almost detached from reality, yet his words were clear enough to alarm those around him. Authorities were notified quickly. Rice had also left a confession note in his apartment and had informed Homer Brand of the Duck Club that he had neutralized the top communist. Within hours, the FBI and local law enforcement took him into custody. From the moment of his arrest, Rice displayed a chilling lack of remorse. In interviews, he insisted that Charles Goldmark was the head of a communist cell plotting against the United States. To Rice, the murder of the children, Derek and Colin, was not cruelty, but a necessary consequence. "I fight to keep people alive, rather than just to kill," he claimed, yet he admitted no guilt for the lives he had extinguished. His tone was cold, clinical, and detached from the horror of his actions. During the trial, Rice's defense team argued that he was insane, citing diagnoses of schizoid personality disorder complicated by paranoid delusions. Dr. Kenneth Muscatel testified that Rice was mentally ill, yet he understood the difference between right and wrong. Prosecutors countered with a detailed picture of premeditation. Rice had studied the Goldmark family for weeks, practiced restraint techniques, experimented with chloroform, and timed his attack for maximum vulnerability. His actions, while inspired by delusions, were deliberate and calculated. The trial, which began on May 12, 1986, gripped the public. Evidence of Rice's obsessive preparation, combined with his extremist beliefs, painted a portrait of a man consumed by ideology and personal failure. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On June 16, 1986, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Judge Francis Holman imposed the death sentence, calling the murders savage brutality carried out against innocent people based on twisted political fantasies. Rice's sentence, however, would not remain. In 1997, following a temporary invalidation of the death penalty in Washington state, his sentence was commuted to life without parole. Today, David Lewis Rice remains imprisoned at the Monroe Correctional Complex. Reports indicate he continues to believe in the lie that drove him to commit these murders, that the Goldmarks were part of a communist conspiracy. His mind, trapped in the same delusions that fueled the crime, remains a haunting testament to how ideology and obsession can culminate in devastating violence. The murders of the Goldmark family were more than a horrific act of violence. They were a chilling demonstration of how ideas, when twisted by paranoia and extremism, can turn deadly. The seeds of this tragedy were planted decades earlier, with a lie about a brief, decades-old association with the Communist Party. That falsehood, amplified by newspapers, extremist groups, and fear-driven rhetoric, never fully died. It lingered in the margins of American politics, resurfacing in the mind of a vulnerable man who found purpose in conspiracy. David Rice did not commit these murders in a vacuum. He was influenced, nurtured, and radicalized by the Duck Club, a small extremist organization that preyed on fears of invisible enemies and secret conspiracies. Their words, their claims, and their distorted warnings gave Rice a framework to justify the unthinkable. What began as misinformation eventually metastasized into a rationale for mass murder. This story matters because it illustrates the lethal power of ideas when left unchecked. It reminds us that propaganda isn't harmless. It can shape perceptions, warp reality, and inspire actions that destroy lives. The Goldmarks were not political figures in the sense that they posed a threat. They were ordinary people, devoted to family, work, and community. And yet, in Rice's mind, fueled by decades-old lies, they became enemies. It also underscores the human cost of radicalization. The Goldmarks' children, Derek and Colin, were innocent bystanders, caught in the web of a delusion far beyond their comprehension. Annie Goldmark, a teacher and mother, was murdered while performing the ordinary acts of daily life. Charles Goldmark, despite his achievements in decency, became a victim not of his own actions, but of someone else's obsession. Finally, the Goldmark story is a cautionary tale for our own times. Extremist rhetoric, conspiracy theories, and politically charged lies are not abstract threats. They can manifest in real, devastating consequences. The Goldmarks' deaths are a stark reminder that what begins in whispers on newsletters, online forums, or closed meetings can escalate into acts of irreversible violence. Remembering this family means more than recounting the horror of their murders. It is about preserving their humanity, acknowledging their lives and accomplishments, and recognizing the dangers of allowing fear, paranoia, and lies to go unchallenged. Their story endures as both a memorial and a warning. Words, when weaponized, can kill, and societies must remain vigilant to prevent history from repeating itself.